Now we're going to interview expert Katrina Ingram. So we'll start off, Katrina, if you could give a quick introduction to the audience about the kind of work that you've been doing and how it relates to what our audience might be doing in data management.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for the invite to spend some time with you. It's always nice to spend time with Nicole and this group. My company name is Ethically Aligned AI, and I started working on the topic of responsible AI back in 2018. I launched my business in 2021, and it was actually through AI that I got into data, which is not a normal pathway. Most people start out with data and then they kind of progress into AI, but that wasn't the case for me. And so the kind of work that I do, it's a little bit varied. I do a lot of educational work, so AI literacy, which includes a very healthy dose of data literacy, but I also do advisory work. So I spent some time with my city. I'm based in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, as their data ethics advisor. And as their advisor, I would look at many of the things that Nicole went through at a very high level, but do that at a deeper level and do it in conjunction with people who would be data governance practitioners, privacy practitioners, the risk and compliance team, data management team. Really be that person who is considering what are the ethical issues, how do we address them, how do we make sure we're acting responsibly, those sorts of things. So I play that role now for clients who want work done in a data ethics advisory capacity. Those are a few things that I do in my business.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I think this is a really crucial topic, and we're going to chat more about how it might be integrated better with data management in the future. Okay, so my first question for you is how do you think new technologies, specifically like the advancements in generative AI that we've really seen accelerating over the last couple of years, how do these emerging technologies change the data management discipline? What information about AI ethics would you like to see incorporated into the new version of the DMBOK that's due out next year?
Yeah, it's funny when you were emphasizing it's 2%, and it is only 2% right now. I'm
Yeah.
hoping that it's much more because for me, I mean, this obviously is my specialization, so I really feel the importance of it. But if you think about any of the issues that we're seeing with AI, whether they're a risk issue directly impacting your business or directly impacting society, you can take those issues and trace them back to some kind of ethical choice that was made. So it really starts to hit every single aspect of that entire wheel. And so if we think about what are we doing with AI, we're using a lot of data, big data, to find patterns in the data through machine learning algorithms. And then we do something based on that. That's something we can generate new information, generative AI. Maybe we're making a prediction. Maybe we're making a recommendation. So something happens on the other end. But it all starts with that data. There's a lot of questions about where did we get that data? Do we have consent to use that data? Maybe we have consent to use that data this way, but maybe not that other way. Should we put these data sets together? How are we securing all that data? There's an awful lot there that could maybe go wrong from a cybersecurity standpoint. So there's ethical touch points throughout all of that. And that's why I think one of the key things in this role is to work well with all the other players that are managing data. And so a lot of this role is sort of understanding a little bit about what all those other pieces are so that you can help them get to making those ethical choices.
Very nice answer. And yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I really loved when I took the CDMP for the first time was getting that broad foundation of what are the different domains that are involved. What do those jobs look like? Because a lot of us, as we grow in our career, we get increasingly pigeonholed and we're becoming an expert in one area of work. So it's useful to take a step back and see what the broader space looks like and also how ethical decisions impact through the whole process. So yeah, I agree with you. I would love to see it be a much more significant focus of the CDMP once they update it to align with the new book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're going to see that. This is my prediction. I haven't actually looked to see where the content is going, but I
Mhm.
do think, given everything that's happening with artificial intelligence, I think this area will get some increased focus.
Awesome. Yeah, great. So currently, as we're looking at chapter two as it exists now, that data handling ethics chapter is focused heavily on data privacy. So, how do you feel about that? What aspects of data ethics kind of overlap with data privacy? And do you feel that data ethics should be, or AI ethics even, should be treated as its own domain?
Yeah, so lots of questions there. Let me kind of unpack that. So I'm actually a certified information privacy professional as well through the IAPP. And I do think privacy is incredibly important, but it is also very narrow, especially in the way that we define it with various laws. So one of the reasons that privacy gets a lot of attention is it has some regulatory teeth to it in many jurisdictions. So I was looking at the list and everybody's from everywhere. So there's a lot going on. I'm in Canada. Let me start there and then I'll talk about the US and I'll talk about globally. In Canada, we have privacy laws both at the federal level and at the provincial level, which would be the equivalent to the states. In the US, you have them mostly at the state level. So you don't have a federal level privacy law, but you have state by state laws and you also have sectoral laws. So things like healthcare, for example, you could think that there would be some pretty private information involved in that. You have laws that govern that. I am not as familiar with everywhere else. I know Europe has some very strong privacy laws. The GDPR, for example, Cadillac level privacy law, globally speaking. But I see folks from all over the world here. And I'm guessing that your country probably has some kind of privacy regulation that you need to adhere to. So that sort of makes privacy elevated in terms of the ethical issues that we might see with data. You mentioned the Belmont report. I find this really interesting to think about. Why did we even get the Belmont report? And it goes back to research, medical research. So there was a lot of unethical research going on back in the day, especially around World War II. And there were things happening that we would just be horrified at now. People sort of said, wait a minute, we can't let this go on. We need to do better. And so what happened is academics got together and they put in place these research principles, things like the Belmont report. And their ability to get funding to do any kind of academic research starts to get tied to these kinds of principles. And that's why these kinds of principles, things like beneficence, respect for persons, which is very much tied to autonomy, and just because we're humans, we deserve to have autonomy and be respected, and ideas of justice, which really speak to fairness and making sure that people are treated well and equitable. All of that gets elevated and then it permeates out from academia into the bigger community, into the business world, into government, and so forth. So you can trace all of this back to that really unethical research that was done a long time ago. And now with artificial intelligence, if you think about what's going on there, I think it just elevates the need to have these principles because a lot of times we're not even really sure what's going on in the black box of AI. So we need to then scrutinize that and make sure that we've kind of started with good ingredients. That's that good quality data going into the system. We've managed it well. And then we're also testing it to make sure that we're not winding up in an unfair place. So I think I might have covered much of what you're asking about, Nicole, but if there's something I missed, feel free to re-ask that part of the question. I'll try and go back to that.
Yeah, well, what I'm hearing is privacy is very narrow, as you said, and it's also very geographically specific. So, yes, I know as they're writing the new book that they want to take more of a global perspective to it. We might see some privacy content in the updated version. Hopefully, we'll also see some increased content on data ethics and AI ethics. And I think that was a really great timeline, too, to discuss why we're still talking about these principles and where they came from.
I'll just add one more thing. It triggered me. It's like it started with privacy. The other thing that comes to mind is I think there used to be this idea that if we can just take out the personally identifying information, the PII, things like our name and identifying numbers, we should be good. We should be okay to share that data. That
Yeah.
starts to change in a world of big data when you can mash up data sets and you can recombine things and you can do this with AI. It starts to challenge that notion of what is privacy and how do we accomplish it. And so that's part of the story too. I think back in the day, it was sort of, we could do these three things and we should be okay. And now it's sort of like, well, maybe not so much. So I think that starts to get into this pushing out privacy into thinking through it in a more holistic way and not just a narrow specific way. But that's challenging, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you have all these laws in different countries and so forth.
Yes, definitely agreed. Privacy is getting much harder as big data has kind of come to the fore. So I guess we're still in the early Wild West in terms of how people are thinking about AI. And I know the EU AI Act is set to come into effect in August later this year. But do you have anything on your kind of wish list of what you'd like to see in terms of regulation or principles for thinking about how to create AI that is more ethically aligned?
Yeah, there's so much to say about this. I think that if we go back to where did we even get all this data and do we have the right to use it? So, one enormous ethical issue when it comes to things like generative AI, large language models, is this notion of whose data is it, anyways? And so it comes down to copyright. And there's a lot of lawsuits around this, and there's a lot of discussion about is this actually fair use and fair dealing? We've transformed the data and we should be allowed to use it to train these models. On the other hand, you have these artists and writers and everyone whose data it is saying, well, wait a minute, I'm not seeing any compensation from that. And in fact, it's even worse than that. Now, this might be competing with me for work. That is an enormous ethical data ethics issue and legal issue at the same time. So that's one thing. Even before we even talk about using it, it's like, how was it made? What goes into it? Related to that, we're starting to have conversations about the environment. And I made a little note when you were saying, per the Dama book, it's about people and organizations. And I wrote down planet. It's also about
Mm,
planet. And I would
yeah,
love to see that in the new version of the book, because I think we need to talk about the environment. So, related to this idea of big data is big processing. And so this big processing requires all these data centers. And that's why we see all of these different stories about data centers that are wanting to be spun up and the energy involved in that. So that's like another big data ethics issue that we need to contend with even before we start using it. And then there's all the using it issues. I think we get into privacy. So, what should we put into a large language model? How do we make sure that we're not putting private information that might compromise ourselves or stakeholders we care about? So, that becomes an issue. How do we make sure that what's coming out of that system isn't biased in some way and isn't causing harmful outcomes for certain groups of people? We've seen a lot of that happen. How do we make sure it's safe? We're seeing stories about people using these systems and winding up in some very dark places, or worse, maybe even suicide and so forth. So there's a lot of these use issues, and all of those are relevant. And I think they all touch on things that are related again, if we go back to the core of all this, data and data ethics.
totally. Yeah, that's really great. And I like how you're talking about the different aspects of the process, like the data center processing and how that impacts the planet, and the potentially stolen copyrighted materials and materials that artists have put online trying to sell their individual work, and how now the tool not just has consumed that material, but because these things are freed, now it's competing with the artists and the writers for their livelihood. And then again, like you said, the final output level of people interacting with the models, and then how that impacts how they think of themselves, how they think of their role in society, etc. There's certainly, like you said, a lot to unpack, a lot to think about there. So let me go back to my questions here. The next one that I had on my list is, can you talk a little bit about the role of data governance in helping support responsible AI?
Sure. If we think of governance, a quick definition, setting up the rules for how we're going to use data could likely at an organizational level. So if we think about that as the objective, let's say, of good governance, we can think about that from the perspective ethically of how do we make sure that those rules that we set up are informed by our ethical principles. So kind of going back to things like beneficence, the do no harm principle, and upholding well-being. So it's two sides of the coin. How do we make sure that the rules that we've set up for how we're going to use data do that? Justice, we can ask the same question. How do we make sure that the rules that we've set up for using data speak to this issue of justice and fairness and equity and so forth? And similarly, with this issue of respect for persons or autonomy, so we can tie our data governance rules and process, and I would even say management of data, directly back to our principles, doing that in real practical ways. For instance, when I work with clients, they might say, I really want to do this particular use case with my data. We could take a look and go, okay, so what might be the ethical issues in doing that? How are you upholding those ethics within your data governance? And does it allow for that? For example, does it allow for data set A to be mixed with data set B? Maybe if you have purpose use limitations on that data that is part of your data governance, it doesn't. And so, even as much as you'd love to use data set B in your analysis, maybe it's like, no, I don't think we're going to do that. So, that's a real practical thing. It lands in this real practical spot where we're not going to use that data for this particular thing. Or if we don't have consent to use a particular piece of data beyond the one thing either, that might be something where it's like, okay, we could use it for that one time that they said we could use it for, and then no more. We got to get rid of that. We can't store it. We can't use it for the future. So again, it plays out in a real practical way, I think.
Yeah, I've seen some really interesting data science statistics talks about how you can combine data using trend vectors or PCA, tease out, create signals from a data set, and really protect the underlying information, because we're then just working with very abstracted vectors. Yeah. So anyway, very cool stuff there. And I agree that should be a key part of data governance. All right. Next question is, how do you think policymakers can best keep pace with the rapid advancements in technology without stifling innovation in AI development?
It's a huge challenge. I mean, it's a huge challenge. Keeping pace is a huge challenge for everyone, never mind the regulators, but just regular people. Regulators also have that burden of something happens, something bad happens, somebody complains about it. a regulator gets involved and then it goes from there. And so there's almost this lag that's built into that entire process. I once saw something about a legal paper about we not regulating things at a super granular level, but putting in place general principles for creating policies that would cover things. I think it was something like you don't need a special regulation for horses, but you can cover the challenges of regulating horses in a more general way. I wish I could remember the name of the paper. But anyways, it's speaking to this idea that we need to figure out what are the principles that we're going to build the regulation around, and then do it in such a way where there's enough flexibility and enough resilience within that system so you're not over prescribing something. I think that it's a skill, it's an art, and it's something that is challenging to do in terms of keeping pace with where AI is going. I don't think it's impossible, though. Even if you look at what Europe's done with the EU AI Act, maybe it's not perfect, but there's a lot of good things in there in terms of upholding the principles, fair information principles around data, some of the things that were included in that Belmont that we've already talked about. All of that is baked into these ideas of how Europe is going to govern AI. So once again, I don't think it's impossible, but it is challenging.
Got it. So we need something and it needs to not be too specific, but it does need to have the principles, real principles in it as well for regulation to be effective. All right, let me ask you, Katrina, is there anything that you feel like I should have asked that we haven't touched on yet? And we'll let that kind of be our last question before we start to wrap up here.
Maybe not something that you should have asked, but I just want to draw out an observation. So data quality, which is actually, I think, 11%, or with a higher percentage, also
Yeah, it
10%.
is.
Yeah, 11%. There is a really interesting relationship between data quality and data ethics. So if you think about what makes quality data, if you think about things like accuracy and these kinds of things, if you don't have those things right, they can actually lead to ethical issues. So there's a lot of intersection between these two topics. And that's something to think about. I'm not saying every data ethics issue is a data quality issue, but many of them are. So that is something to really think about, like getting something wrong about someone, whether that is unintentional or not, or you have duplicates of people and you think that this person is that person. And these kinds of things play out into ethical issues that happen for people in real life.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought so much about data quality as like an important input, but certainly it is. Great, cool. So thank you guys so much for joining. Thank you so much, Katrina, for being our subject matter expert today.
Thank you.
Yeah, really fun as always to talk with you. It's a really complicated topic, and you do such a great job of breaking it down into systematic parts and then really addressing how the rubber meets the road in terms of how people get things done. So, yeah, thank you guys so much for attending. Best of luck with your studies and have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.